Alright, welcome to my little video essay. This is probably going to be one of the first of a series of sort of blog posts, video blog posts. And this time I've just decided to dive a bit into neurotechnology, my previous occupation and work, and sort of if it's utopian or dystopian. I talked with a friend the other day about doing that, and well, here I am. So, Neurotech, Utopia or Dystopia. First of all, let's just talk about what Neurotech is. Basically, it's either technology or some electrical components that are meant to monitor or modulate neural activity in especially humans, but also generally in any cerebral animal. And it's used a lot in neuroscience research and can really give a lot of new perspectives there because it's empirical. So we don't create models, our own descriptive or our own prescriptive models of what the brain should do, but we sort of generate descriptive models based on what the brain actually does when we put in technology that can directly modulate or read neural activity. And right now in the research world, we're seeing some of the greatest applications of this is in paraplegics, people who can't move their arms or legs or both for that matter. They are able to control robot arms and they're able to interact with computers. They're basically able to, for example, write a lot of words that we would also normally be able to write with a keyboard, which is amazing work. And this is, in the neuroprosthetics domain. So prosthetics that like enhance our abilities, and brain-computer interfaces are then, the interfaces themselves between the brain and whatever external effector, as we call it, there is out there. And these neuroprosthetics, they're very useful for people with neural disorders. For example, a very good example is the locked-in syndrome, where we cannot see if people are conscious. They don't have any way to interact with the outside world. But we can check if they're conscious because they can hear, by asking them, for example, imagine playing golf when you want to answer yes to this question. Imagine you are reading a book when you want to answer no. And then we can begin asking questions and see if they actually are conscious as well. Otherwise, sometimes we haven't been able to do this. And this generalizes into reading thoughts more generally as well, of course. But this is just one of the many ways besides the robot arms and so on. And it's already today being used creatively in different domains. We're seeing cognitive enhancement, for example, being quite up in the times. So you have a lot of consumer devices that you are able to hook into, and they will give you a current through your neural pathways, which will create more activity or less activity in different areas of the brain. We've been working with a few of those for some that would inhibit a region that naturally inhibits creativity in humans. So because we have these different pathways that information travels in the brain. So if we're able to hit a junction that's really relevant for some specific capability, and we can just slightly modify the neural activity there, we can actually have quite a large effect on the brain. And there are different technologies for this. The consumer technologies are only in the current space. But otherwise there's also magnetoencephalography that can read. There's electroencephalography, there's fMRI, FNIRS, there's TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, and a lot of other technologies in this domain that help us both read and write to the brain, monitor or modulate. And as mentioned, we're seeing a lot of possibilities in the research space with this. A lot is happening there, and we're going to probably see much more modularity and more, combining this and that. We've been working with some from NearX, an FNIRS system, where it could just hook up to the Wi-Fi system locally and transmit data there. So you could actually do sports with it on as well and so on, which is very difficult to do with some of the other tools because they're so sensitive. Especially the electrically monitoring systems such as EEG and MEG. Some of the companies that are in the space, there's a lot of different companies. I just mentioned NearX, for example, but you have Kernel, you have Neuralink, you have BlackRock Neurotech, you have GTech Medical, you have Neurable and BrainCo, many others. These have like different philosophies for how they want to go about this. Kernel, for example, they're doing non-invasive, which just means things that go on top of the head instead of inside it. So they've developed a new functional near-infrared spectroscopy system. They've developed a new magnetoencephalography system, which is relatively revolutionary compared to the existing technology. So a lot of money from Brian Johnson there went into that. And Neuralink, you might know it, you probably know it. It's Elon Musk's endeavor to sort of create this ability to have a lot of external effectors and consumer technology, and basically a chip in the brain that everyone sort of wants to have in. BlackRock Neurotech, they've been the leader in the space of actually implanting systems that can, for example, are used for these word interfaces and robot arms and so on. And they've done really well, and they really want to, alleviate neural suffering, neural disorders, and so on. Gtech Medical, they're very much in the space of being more, they're doing more open things. They're doing consumer tech, but also a lot of research tech, a lot of fun things, creative things, and they are, they're very much working to expand the BCI space, so brain-computer interfacing space. So they are, for example, doing hackathons. They're doing a lot of outreach, workshops, and so on. Getting to conferences. And Christoph Gruber there, he's great. He's a great guy. And Neurable is working on some other type of tech, which is quite interesting. And Brainco is also working. And then there's many more. There might even be hundreds by now. I haven't kept too updated, but there's definitely a lot. A lot of the consumer technology devices as well are coming out. And then a little discussion of what utopia and dystopias actually mean. So the original definition of utopia comes from the book called Utopia by Thomas More. And this is basically a book about how this guy in the new world finds a utopia, funnily enough, called Utopia. And it's this world that has, communism, good working environments, everyone's equal, knowledge, everyone's very clever, nobody thinks about money and all these types of things, and sort of set the tone for what utopias were. Of course, there's also been utopias before Thomas More's there in 1516. For example, the Faber Book of Utopias is from an Oxford professor, and it describes, it summarizes utopias from a lot of different fictional work, all the way from the Egyptians until, today, this century itself. And it's actually a great book. I really recommend it. You can go through a lot of different ones and get specific opinions on how the utopias are formed and so on. But you see a few different utopia types. You see religious, ethical, you see societal, you see technological, a bunch of different types. And then there's often some recurring characteristics. For example, non-reliance on money, equality, society, like a strong government is quite normal because then they can help the people and they can make sure that everyone is having a good time. And oftentimes there's also a bunch of philosophical thought in utopias about how humans, like men and women and other genders for that matter, they interact and how they should have children and how families are formed, and if families at all are formed, or if they're raised in central kindergartens, stuff like this. And the opposite of utopia is of course a dystopia. Some people prefer the wording anti-utopia or cacotopian. Anti-utopia basically because utopia has a very strong connotation, and anti-utopia is like the reverse of that, so a very strong negative connotation. And we see in the real world some of the risks from thinking in this utopia direction is, for example, the practical application of communism in the Soviet Union and in China, where millions died of starvation because we just weren't at a stage of abundance yet, but it was prescriptively added upon society instead of descriptively adding it in a way that was healthy. So there are some risks. And some of the ways we can alleviate this is, for example, utilitarianism, just taking the thing that works, sort of. And an example of this is like the Scandinavian utilitarian capitalist socialism, where they often, they take the best parts of capitalism and socialism and put them together. So an amazing place for entrepreneurs and an amazing place for the working population as well. And you might think, okay, that's also idealized. But it is a protocol that's extendable and generalizable to other areas of the world as well. And to just some specific utopias that are quite relevant for this neurotechnology. One of the classics is Walden 2 by B.F. Skinner from the early 1900s, where B.F. Skinner is a behavioral psychologist. He created behaviorism, and it's basically about this world where we are able to modulate our feelings and emotions, and be in a world where our emotions aren't blocking us. And one way where this might go wrong, he describes it as a utopia. But Aldous Huxley in Brave New World describes this world where people are taking soma, which is a drug that makes people happy. And sure, it makes people happy, and the government uses it to make the population more docile. But everyone's still, doing a lot of like utopian stuff. But it's described as a dystopia. He also coins the term transhumanism at one point. And then you have more in another direction, not necessarily neurotech, but with George Orwell's 1984, you have propaganda and control of the populace's minds in non-invasive ways, with psychological interaction to some degree. And you can see these are some of the risks that we might hit on with neurotechnology. I'll talk a bit more about that later. And then probably one of the most relevant ones is transhumanism. Aldous Huxley was one of the founders of the Word, or like instigators of the Word. Natasha Vita-Moore wrote the Transhumanist Manifesto in 1999, which is about more of like what the transhumanist ideals are. Bostrom has been in this space as well. Nick Bostrom, he's also written a book about artificial general intelligence and the risks thereof. And Sandberg is still talking a lot about cognitive enhancement and understanding what opportunities arise in the future. And Ray Kurzweil is definitely, he's taking a lot of different pills. So he really wants to, extend his lifespan with the use of technology. And transhumanism more generally is the idea that we shouldn't be scared of technology in improving our well-being and improving the human condition and basically taking the next step in evolution. But we should use it and we should interact with it and understand its consequences. Some neurotechnology utopias you might think of. There's here I've just listed a few from, if you take the company ideals to the end. So for example, Kernel, they want to instigate a neuroscience revolution. So make sure that a lot of people, like maybe 10,000 people, have their hardware. And then on an internet platform, neuroscientists can just have people do a lot of different experiments on themselves and get a lot of data. Today, it can cost nearly $250,000 or something to get a good sample size, because you have to rent fMRI space, you have to, get a whole hospital department to join in the experiments and have bureaucracy and so on work alongside of all these experiments you're running. While if Kernel's vision becomes true, we'll see a neuroscience revolution. And the utopia we can imagine from this goes far beyond just understanding more of the brain, but actually understanding more of the brain makes us able to possibly create peaceful civilizations, modulate human neural activity, so we are able to just have a better life. And a holistic understanding of neuroscience generates a lot of information, both about philosophy, free will and so on, consciousness, and about what we can do with the brain and how we can understand the brain. So that's quite a utopian ideal. And then if you go with the BlackRock neurotech direction, then making sure that cerebral disorders are no more, and that we are able to stop brain disorders from happening and neural disorders, simply by way of alleviating it with these technological solutions. And I imagine there's more than this. There's not just the technology, but not just the electrical equipment, but there's also pills. There's fake adrenaline instigators and so on. But going far out, that's sort of the case that we want to ensure that people don't have negative neural disorders. And with Neuralink, it's this external effects view, right, where you're developing a lot of ways that normal people can get a chip implanted, and then just go ahead and use it for nearly anything. And this will, of course, generate a revolution in sort of our interaction and how we work with the world. But there's more where that comes from. And Anna Sandberg, he talks about cognitive enhancement quite a bit, and genetics and neurotech. So genetics specifically being able to help us increase our intellect and so on, which is quite interesting. You know, having a world where you have cognitively enhanced humans is really good for competing with AI, right? Making sure that we are on the same sort of intellectual level to some degree, but of course carries with it some risks. And then you have philosophy and the arts. You can imagine that if we get this whole new human experience, that a lot of different art is going to happen, right? If I can get signals directly implanted in the brain, that means that artists will be able to generate a whole new experience. For example, I might not need to travel somewhere because artists have created a sort of neural simulation of that place. And this sort of simulation, you know, it can go far beyond just a simulation of a real world place, but it can also be a whole new experience of how the world works. It can be a whole new experience of how I see the world as I look here, for example. And this goes directly into virtual realities. We can, you know, generate new perspectives from each other's sides. We can have education in virtual space. We can democratize a lot more of the intellectual capacity and learning we have in society. And we are able to, as mentioned, you know, get perspectives from the other side that are completely different from the perspectives we can generate today. So, of course, this goes in the other direction as well, but I'll talk about that afterwards. So virtual realities are really, really interesting. And one of the reasons that I also went into it in the beginning, it was, you know, it would solve a lot of different things. If we get neurotechnology, we can, for example, possibly solve some of the problems that is with interstellar travel. If you have to get a brain down into a state for, you know, 100 years or something like that for a flight, then we need to understand a lot more of the brain, the whole neuroscience revolution, and we also need some sort of embedding mechanism, you know, getting the brain in a vat and making sure that the humans survive, maybe cryogenically, maybe not. And there's a lot of understanding, you know, what happens afterwards when they wake up and so on. There's also the possibility that, if there's a virtual world and I can get a lot of different things in the virtual world, then you don't need the consumerism of the real world, because I can get a Ferrari or whatever in the virtual world, which will alleviate a lot of the emissions, carbon emissions, and the negative parts of that whole process, you know, resource scarcity and so on. And when it comes to philosophy more generally, neurotechnology and brain-computer interfacing is sort of a philosophy, right? It's this basis whereupon can we understand the human brain more and thereby garner more philosophical insights. For example, we already see now that the brain is much more complex. We have much more individualistic tendencies, or like how we've learned to see the world. And at the same time, it's amazing that we are so similar. We see general computation. We also see that we might not be different from animals, right? In terms of the neural structuring. And there's just, you know, for example, language and social skills that have developed. And now we're able to learn so well. But that's sort of the only things that make the difference. So there's a lot of understanding the philosophy of neurotech that pushes us forward. For example, in human diversity, if we are able to create neurotechnology that like enhances people's abilities to think and gives this, you know, cognition as a possibility, then we might see that every direction of thought is explored much more in depth and much more effectively and much more uniquely and so on, because we have so many people with a new perspective on the world. Where, for example, with machine learning, we see that, you know, they take the average of culture. They can also, of course, simulate different scenarios. Here I'm talking about the language models, but in reality, you know, maybe we'd want the unique perspective of human cognition here instead of more simplistic architectures. And of course, in the future, there'll probably be much more advanced AI as well. So we'll see how that works out. And then you have the social worlds and communication. Of course, there hasn't really been like good modalities except language and multimodal communication before. Now, the many ways, you know, for example, keyboards have been quite good and new ways of interacting in VR, for example. But direct neural communication will, you know, create a revolution in the social world and in the communication we can have. You can imagine, I do know Xixin Liu, you know, the aliens there, they can't lie, they can't hide their thoughts. So they they are, you can imagine some of the same dynamics happening, some of the same level of interconnectedness between humans. And I don't know how that would look, but there's a lot of possibilities in this sort of complete overhaul of how we communicate in the first place. And maybe at some point we won't even have language anymore. We'll just communicate using neural ways and who knows, concepts. Of course, with utopias come a few dystopias as well. There's some of the quite relevant ones today is neuronormativity and convergent mediocrity. Basically, we look at the world right now, right? You have social media, the internet, and so on, and maybe thought in general becomes focused on one pathway if many people see the same thing. We don't get the same diversity of thought, the same diversity of cognition. Of course, we also get a more stable society because you have more cultural normativity between people, more of monoculture. But at the same time, this is a risk in terms of limiting our ability to think diversely. When we apply that to neurotechnology and go even farther, then, today we might get images from the internet onto our retina, and then we transform that into thoughts based on all of our experiences. But if it's brain-computer interfacing, we might get the exact same neural inputs, which can create literal neuronormativity, and very, very similar brains, which can be, from my perspective at least, it's quite a big risk to the human intellectual endeavor. I don't imagine it'll be that big of a problem, because we'll probably see the general divergence of thought. And right now it's also a debate if the internet has been a neuronormative construct, or if it's been more of a, making, for example, me able to do this neurotechnology deep dive here, a little Utopia Dystopia deep dive, because I've been able to search through these deep pathways. So if it's, it's dependent, you probably get more neuronormativity, you probably also get more neurodivergence. So I wonder if Neurotech want to do the same. The other part is, if we begin working with transhumanism in general, but especially neurotechnology and more radical implants or implementations of technology, then we might have, we get a divergence from evolutions. And maybe evolution is a meta-optimized system, maybe it is actually the optimized system for sort of developing ourselves. And from there you can also see cultural evolution is also a relatively safe process, of course, except wars and so on. But cultural evolution, we see it's a pretty optimized method and a good system for reaching to a world that we have today, for example. It's taken very short, and maybe evolution is just pretty good. And this would play into the naturalistic conservatism perspective on the world, where we don't want to just bombard ourselves with a lot of technology, because we'd probably want more to live as our ancestors, or whatever, or how evolution meant our bodies to be used. And the evolutionary divergence in general is also, it comes with a lot more risks, right? Just in general for how the human body works. One of these risks being, for example, mind control. So Jack Rafferty wrote this article, this sort of opinion commentary paper about how dictatorships right now, they go, total control of the population, no dictatorship and democracy, total control of the population, and so on. It goes in these waves based on how much control you have of the population, basically. And with brain-computer interfacing and neurotechnology, we'll see that, you can have, dictatorship, democracy, and then here Neurotech is invented that works to control people's thoughts and minds. And you see complete control, and you won't have the chance to go back, because they of course buy into the system as well, even though they might be suffering and so on. So this is a really dangerous part of brain-computer interfacing, where we'll see that, okay, if some malicious actor gets control or hacks their way into, or a dictator enforces it upon its population, then we'll just see a lot of problems with this. And some of these things is that, some of these problems is, for example, value lock-in. William McCaskill talks a lot about that in his new book, What We Are the Future. Basically, if our values as humanity were locked 20 years ago, maybe there wouldn't be vegetarians as such. Maybe we would have of course, the whole of India and a lot of other people. But for example, in Western Europe, maybe we wouldn't have vegetarians and this sort of climate idealism and all these ways of working. And we would probably, if the values were locked in 1940s, we would still be not having that many women in the workforce and all these sorts of things. So anything that leads to value lock-in is quite dangerous. And mind control, of course, leads to value lock-in. Neuronormativity leads to value lock-in. Not lock-in necessarily, but like to different degrees. And more generally, value lock-in can occur if we develop neurotech too much. And we can imagine futures where we have completely different values compared to today. Where we'll look back and it'll be barbaric that we were working for money, being this evil concept or whatever. There can be a lot of different changes in our value systems. And then otherwise, on the deep immersion side, on the virtual reality side, Ready Player One played a bit with this idea, but it's been described a lot before as well. Basically, that if we are deeply immersed in this environment, in the virtual environment, then why would we be in the real world? And I think this seems to require a lot of different measures in a lot of different other technical domains to make sure that the body stays alive and that people don't just leave the world and get addicted to the virtual world and so much else. That's quite dangerous. And if we talk more generally about the brain and that idea, go even deeper immersion, then might we end with something like the Matrix, where humans are just used for some weird purpose and they're just simulators of their own experience and so on. And maybe we will, maybe we won't. But there's a lot of risks in this, where why would we be in the real world if the virtual world is much better? And then there's a lot of questions, about, okay, should we then actually, do we need to focus on the real world then, or should we just focus on the virtual world? Because that's the new world. And that's a big question. It'll probably also create a lot of scientific advances, so we can run the real world with AI or something like that, if we are very lucky. The final possibilities is a very classic one. It's like intelligence hierarchies. If some get genetic modification and neurotechnology and these different ways of enhancing their cognitive power, then do we end up with some sort of world where the people who don't have the implants, they're just not valuable to society, or we have some sort of probability estimate for people going in jail. So, okay, if you are 99% probable of going in jail or committing a crime, then we put you in jail. And you stay there for the same amount of time as the crime would actually take. Then we lose a lot of what the legal state is based upon, the judicial state. And there's a lot of questions in this whole sphere of how it will change society more generally. And there's probably a lot of ways it'll change it negatively and a lot of positive ways as well. Then, if neurotech might perpetuate dictatorships, might create neuronormativity and has a bunch of risk associated with it, then what are some of the alternative utopias we can go for? And what are the things we can do to make sure these go well? Some of the ones, they are, of course, what I'm working with right now is artificial general intelligence, creating intelligence that can help humanity on the whole, solve a lot of problems and so on. And the very important part to make sure we have right is AI safety, making sure that the super intelligent AIs, when they get there, that they are actually aligned with our values. When we ask it to mow the lawn, then they don't mow every single strain of grass in the whole city or something like this, and they don't scorch the earth to just remove the grass, but they actually understand what we mean when we say verbs. Because in general, syntactical trees and Noam Chomsky and linguistics has been very rule-bound and so on. But we've seen recently, all the way from the 70s and 80s and so on, cognitive linguistics, where we just see that we don't have pure definitions of what words mean. They're all, interrelationally connected. And it's cyclical logic, which many, after Descartes, a lot of the circular logics was removed, but in reality, when we look deep enough, most logic is not sequential. So cyclical logic there makes it very hard to define concepts in the proper way. And this is some of just one of the different sub-projects that AI safety works with. How can we code values correctly? And can we make it safe more generally? Can we ensure that, can we monitor their thoughts so they don't destroy humanity for some odd reason? And this is quite a relevant field to work in. The other utopia, we've talked a bit about it, but genetic engineering. And generally with genetic engineering, we can achieve a lot of interesting things in the world. We can create, bio-robots, xenorobots, and so on. But there are biorisks, a lot of biorisks here. So making sure that this goes well requires a lot of people interested in ensuring that the world does not end up with another coronavirus leaking from a lab because someone was playing around with it, or from, I don't know, some random basement in Kansas or something like that, because they could just order a malicious genetic strain. These types of things. And then you have the utopia of abundance, and here you might be working with alleviating global poverty and making sure that everyone has money and lives and so on, making sure that money is redistributed throughout societies, throughout the world in general. And I think this is a really good baseline to work from, a baseline of abundance where we aren't leaving people behind and where we also get a bit of equality. Of course, this plays directly into utilitarianism. So if we can ensure the utopia of a world without suffering, and that's, in practicality, it's reducing animal and human suffering, both in the short term but also in the long term. So we can work, for example, with animal welfare and ensure that shrimp farms in Vietnam, they give enough space to their shrimp, because shrimp seem to have neural pathways that are relatively conscious, and there's so many of them. And we can make sure that human disease is eradicated, and so on. A lot of things here. It's also called global health when we talk about humans, and for example, reducing the amount of malaria in sub-Saharan Africa. And more generally, utilitarianism also looks at the long term. I mentioned Will MacAskill's book. It all basically talks about what we owe to our future generations, because sure, we can do a lot right now, but if we make sure that these 100 years go well, then we might persist as a species for thousands of millennia. Like, it could be up to billions and even trillions of years if we're lucky. There's this idea of the most important century, which is basically that right now we live in the most important century for humanity to persist as a whole. One, we are all stuck here on Earth. Everyone's here. No one's on Mars yet. No one has populated the stars. No one has found different ways of living that aren't interconnected with the current world. That's like different enough that they can escape existential risks. And the other part is that we are now able to instigate existential risks on humanity itself with our own technologies. For example, genetic engineering, AI, nuclear winter, and so on. There's a bunch of different things we can do now because of technology. And this goes into also the naturalist conservatism, right? Where one way to make sure that these risks don't happen is to just not do them and make sure that humans can live and persist as we do now. But this is of course hard because you have to stifle innovation, you have to stifle a lot of technological development. So these are some of the things in utilitarianism. And then if we want a society with equal opportunity and equality in general for all genders, races, and so on, and even ages for that matter, then there's a lot of possibility in going into legislation and politics for that matter, governance, for how, to change how societies work in terms of this process. Sure, we can do a lot of cultural work as well, but it's probably going to be more relevant to actually implement direct interventions. And another way is to do science on it. So basically, figure out a lot of ways where equality is better, and then just share it as a pamphlet for lobbyists to give to governments and so on. It'll probably change a lot of things there. I think there's huge opportunity, and we are of course seeing more equality day by day. Then a utopia of peace, making sure that peace persists. Ray Dalio recently wrote a really nice book about the cycles of empires. And right now we've been in peacetime for a long while in the Northern Hemisphere. Now Russia is, playing a bit with the idea of stopping that, unfortunately. But in general, throughout millennia, societies that have been in peacetime for a long while, they always think that peace will persist and that now is an age without war. We've stopped having wars. And this is of course not true if we look back in time. So it's the worry that now maybe things are just scaling up, and we might see wars actually happening again. And yeah, this can go several ways. And some of the ways you can maybe work with peace and ensuring peace is the mediation between antagonistic parties, interlocutors, making sure that they get a win-win situation. Talk with one, talk with the other, and figure out what they're doing, what do they want, and can we actually combine these hopes in good deals and so on. And the other way is more of a research effort towards incentives design and designing incentives in the world that are disparate from the current incentives of maybe honor or glory or expansionism or size or dominance, all these types of things. Where can we actually figure out new ways that different countries would want incentives to, they would want specific rewards for doing a behavior that's more aligned with the world in general. And then a utopia, value alignment, making sure that sort of everyone has good values, whatever that means. And of course, whoever defines good values will have a lot of, so the burden of proof that they are the best values. And to create a world where people agree about, for example, you might go into theoretical ethics, but for example, we can kickstart the sort of value shift through generations. So avoid the value lock-in. Value alignment might also create a value lock-in, but we can avoid the value lock-in by just creating more and more new understandings of what ethics means. For example, population ethics has received a bit of attention the past years as well. And then you have the utopia of freedom. I especially like cognitive freedom and the ability for neurodivergence to persist through time. So we get different perspectives on the world because we are sort of in the pre-paradigmatic stage of humanity's interplanetary expansion and so on. So it's very interesting for me, this part. So here we might see like a decoupling of interpersonality or like interconnectivity, and making sure, for example, Switzerland has a very stable country, and they are 26 or whatever it is, different municipalities or regions that collaborate about making this Switzerland thing a thing. And this sort of owning this freedom is quite important. Another part of the freedom ideal is to work on there's a really good essay by Oscar Wilde called The Soul of Man Under Socialism. It's basically about how people should always be creative, or not should, but they want to be creative. We want to strive to achieve what we ourselves are. And socialism is one of the ways we can do this, because then we remove the monetary control on the creative endeavors. And then if you take that thought even further, you end up with a sort of anarcho-socialism where people can exist, for example, by the aid of AI or something like this, without any problems and in abundance. And they also aren't dependent on the social pressures of people around them. So we can create art and, express ourselves in ways that are completely our own, without being dependent on a lot of other things. So these are some of the ideals. I do think that's a utopia as well, because right now the human cognition is very designed to be social, and money works quite well for incentivizing productivity and food and all these types of things. Yeah. So that's sort of a little overview of Neurotech Utopia Dystopia. And I've written a few questions. So one of the questions might be, I've heard people talk about the singularity. What is that? Basically, the singularity is this idea that at some point, probably like from 2032 to 2049 or 2052 or whatever you might put the number at, if we follow the trend lines of economic development and of AI development, of computers, of all these things, then we end at a point where the models, they seem to hit a point that just seem totally impossible, like 100 times bigger GDP in 2037 or something like this. And we might think, okay, this is impossible, but what happens at this singularity? That's a giant question. So there's a lot of discussion about this in the field right now. And I think it's super interesting to look at and very, very relevant for what we want to work on ourselves in this, utopian idealist perspective. And so the singularity is very important and will change a lot of things. And maybe, longer term effects from peace and so on won't be as relevant as working on AI or whatever, because the singularity is a thing in so few years. So that's one thing. When do you expect societal collapse? So I don't know. I don't know if I expect societal collapse, but read Dali's book there, for example, it definitely made opened my eyes a bit more to the possibility that societal collapse will be a thing. And I think there is a chance, but it'll probably be accompanied by either nuclear fallout, nuclear war, and so on, or accompanied by an AI taking over, or some sort of very, very drastic thing, a pivotal act that destroys society for some reason. I don't know when. I imagine if the singularity is a thing, maybe it'll happen there, or if it's not, we'll see like either the singularity happening or a societal collapse from some sort of cultural compression, or something where we are just forced to live way below our means, or something like this. And how much are you spending your time on neurotechnology right now? So how much I'm spending my time. So I'm not actually working on neurotechnology. Sometimes I go into the field, just checking it out, and go to some hackathons and so on. But I'm mainly working on AI safety, and I think this is extremely important for the future of our civilization, because if we can create good value-aligned AGI, then that means that basically all these other problems will be solved, because it'll be so intelligent that it can solve them. And on the other side, if we create AGI that's not aligned with us, if we develop something that's just so capable, but we can't control it, then you'll see in January you have AI has replaced junior programmers, we're having a good society, and then in December Mercury is getting terraformed or something like this. And that's why I'm working on AI safety and not neurotechnology, but neurotechnology is definitely very, very exciting as well. Do I think we'll make it beyond the solar system? I think if we survive this century, definitely. If not, then we don't survive. But I really hope we do survive, and there's a very low risk of everyone dying, right? One of the biggest risks of this is AI, but in general there's a very low risk, and so if we if even 1 million, 2 million of us survive in a close-knit enough society, then we can rebuild, and we'll probably not hit something that's really bad from that. Like, for example, Horizon Zero Dawn is an example of like a post-collapse human society with robots roaming around and so on. So it's very interesting. I think we will make it beyond if we survive this century. So that'll be quite nice. If utopias are dangerous, how can we mitigate these risks? So I imagine, again, sort of the Scandinavian utilitarian capitalist socialism, where we can just work towards a world that's better than today and take all the good things from here and there. And we can work on, for example, the things I mentioned in the alternative utopias, working on the solutions to the risks themselves. And I think there's just a lot of opportunity in not thinking in utopias, but thinking in the next step for society, which also plays into, for example, looking at the stages of society. For example, Karl Marx said that we probably needed capitalism and abundance before we could implement communism, because we need so many resources that people don't have to work that much, and that we can actually, a lot of different things there. But taking the best from different parts and then just progressing along in a descriptive fashion, it seems very good, without ensuring that we don't hit value lock-in, because then a society might not progress beyond the current status. So these are some of the ways. Don't overly subscribe to an idea, and also take all the good parts. I like to think of it as like convex living. So taking the best parts of the extremes, but not taking that much in the medium between those two, because it's just not interesting in there. Like, we don't get much by creating both like having money in half of society and not having it in the other half. Will create a lot of disbalances and so on. So that's the type of thing. We'll want to take the best of both worlds. And that's the questions. I really hope you enjoyed this little talk, and I'll post it online somewhere, and we'll see what happens. Probably also on my webpage. But thank you for following along, and I hope you learned a bit. I did at least. So thank you.